And then Kyle Larson, unfortunate situation there, crashing out right before the halfway point. And honestly, I was thinking to myself, maybe this crash was a blessing in disguise for him, because looking at the time the Indy 500 finish, he would have had to, retire the car early to get to Charlotte. So there was no way Kyle Larson was going to be able to go the distance, if it wasn't for the crash. So it was just an unfortunate situation. I know we were talking about this amongst ourselves on our private chat, saying that Kurt Busch's double effort, over a decade ago was not respected enough because of what he was able to do. Go to Indy, get a top 10 finish. He was knocking on the door, the top five. I know Kurt Busch had a late practice crash, able to recover from that, ended up having a flawless race. Then, he went to Charlotte to try to complete the double and had an issue there where, ended up not finishing the NASCAR race there. And in order for this double to work, I know you guys are going to talk more about it during the NASCAR section. I just wanted to say, in order for this to work, you need the perfect storm because and unfortunate for Larson, 2 years in a row, rain really dampened things. A late start to the Indy 500 last year, it ended up, putting a damper on his plans. And then this year, rain delayed it for an entire hour. And then I wonder what's worse, crashing out before halfway or not crashing out and then having to park the car earlier. Is just a real unfortunate situation for him.
Kobe, I think talking about Kyle Larson having a perfect storm for the, for the Indy 500 double to go right.
It's going to turn into a show of attrition.
Yeah.
Knocking him out.
Yeah, like I'm sure he doesn't want to hear the word storm cell, drizzle, any sort of precipitation. He doesn't want to hear anything about that for like probably the rest of the year.
Yeah, probably. And it's just a situation where you needed everything to go right. You need the race to start on time. You don't need to have any big crashes that could cause a red flag. You need to have a relatively clean race by the entire field. Yeah, you need to have perfect weather, and you need to just go in, do your job, and go out to Charlotte, and then go do your job there. But unfortunate that 2 years in a row, weather has ruined the double for him. And I'm sure a lot of people have been wondering if there anything can be done in the future to accommodate, the double attempt. Like maybe start the Indy 500 earlier in the day. I know Green Flag was scheduled for 12:46 p.m. Eastern time. Maybe if they moved it back to let's say 12:15 in the future. I know the Indy 500 used to start earlier in the day in the past. Maybe if they went back to the old start time, that would potentially give a driver attempting a double more room to work with if there is a weather delay, because the window, is just too short. I know Larson was talking about how logistically speaking, this is just a very hard thing to pull off. And in Kurt Busch's case, he had the perfect storm over a decade ago. The race started at a good time. It didn't run too long. He was able to do Indy, get out of there, with enough time to land and, in Charlotte for the pre-race ceremonies.
Jonathan, seeing Kyle Larson struggle, I know you all talked a bit about it on the IndyCar. Does this remind everyone how challenging the double is? I mean, essentially that perfect storm analogy. And overall, do you see anybody else planning to do the double anytime soon, whether it's a full-time NASCAR or even throw out full-time IndyCar driver?
When you ask that question, that reminds me of when I was at my occupational therapist, my hand, I told them about Kyle Larson doing the 1,100-mile double, and they're like, wow, I couldn't even do that in my car, let alone doing it at full speed, and it's incredible. Like, it really is an incredible feat, and it's hard, and I think Kyle Larson is also a very mental driver, and I know he ran well early on in that race, but just to have a mistake like that early on in the race where, he got into the wall and then eventually spun after that, it's so tough, like, to overcome the struggles that you may face in one race to do well in another. Like we talked about with Kurt Busch, he had the perfect storm of everything where he was able to run a really good, clean, problem-free race, which is, as we learned this year, is not easy in the Indy 500. And then he went to Charlotte where, again, he had an engine issue. Anything can go wrong. Anything can happen. And I really think that, Kyle Larson struggling yesterday, one of the greatest drivers in the whole world. It is a challenge doing the double, and it really brings greater respect to what Tony Stewart did back in the day when he was able to complete all 1,100 miles.
Yeah, I think that the kind of like recency bias we have with it, with so many nearly successful runs. Obviously, Kurt Busch's comes to mind, where had it not been for a blown motor, he probably ends that race on the lead lap and completes all 1,100 miles for Tony Stewart's race team at the time. Unfortunately, though, for Kyle Larson, that would not be the case this Sunday. I do agree with Jonathan that it really brings into scope truly how difficult this task is. Not just the, wear and tear of the day itself, where you have to do so much travel. You are, in a sense, living on a clock and having to be mindful of when the race starts, when the race ends, kind of what else is happening during the race. It's a lot to really juggle in your mind, on top of I'm trying to win the greatest spectacle in racing. On top of that, you go from trying to win the greatest spectacle in racing to running the longest race that exists in oval racing in the Coca-Cola 600, which in itself is a feat of strength. That's why you see a lot of drivers get, some of their first starts in NASCAR at the Cup Series level at the Coca-Cola 600. Team owners want to make sure that you have the stamina and the determination to get through those 600 miles over 400 laps around the very ruthless and, bumpy Charlotte Motor Speedway. So I think it really brought into perspective, even with how talented Kyle Larson is, as I've talked about on this program many times before. He is cartoonishly talented. But unfortunately, we saw the other side of that coin for him, where he makes some cartoonishly poor mistakes that ultimately took him out of both races. And granted, I do think he may have had a shot to come back in the Coke 600 had he not gotten clipped in that crash. It looked like he was starting to at least make up some spots, and we've seen that Hendrick Motorsports bunch obviously bounce back from Larson tearing the car up or a mechanical error of some kind, come back and, win races, even at the Roval in particular. But at the same time, it's again, a big reminder that the NASCAR Cup Series is nothing to fool with, especially at this rough and tumble oval that we went to last night. And the Indianapolis is still the driver's racetrack for open wheel. And unfortunately, both of them kind of bit Kyle Larson yesterday. And I hope it doesn't dissuade drivers in the future from doing the double. But, I can kind of see, after the logistical nightmares that we've seen in the last 2 years, how difficult it's going to be to pull off.